everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Shireen and I'm moderating today's conversation, Crisis and Uprising in Lebanon, the Roots of the Explosion. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to thank the organizers and sponsors of this teach-in, Haymarket Books and the DSA's International Committee. It is critical that we support independent publishers and organizations during this time. You can do this by buying books from Haymarket and joining the Haymarket Book Club. You can also do this by making a donation to Anti-Racism Movement Lebanon, a migrant community organization in Lebanon. We've posted more details about this in the event page, and I believe everyone who signed up on Eventbrite, 50% of their donation went to the Anti-Racism Movement Lebanon. So this video will be recorded and shared on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with as many people as possible. Also, there are two upcoming events in the Haymarket livestream series. Next Wednesday, August 26th, join us for Marx Was Right, Economics for the 99% at 5 p.m. EDT. Next Thursday, August 27th, join us for Aftershocks of a Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for these upcoming events on Eventbrite, and the links to sign up are being posted on the chat. A few more housekeeping items. For folks who want to follow the chat, we suggest you use the top chat option rather than live chat. People who violate our community guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we're able. And with so many people joining the call, we may need your patience if we have any technical issues. If the stream gets choppy, it might help to reduce your image quality. Folks will give instructions on how to do so in the chat. If our YouTube feed is interrupted for any reason, you may need to navigate back to the YouTube Haymarket Books page. The feed should resume there in case of interruption. This event will have live closed captions. To enable captions, click the CC button on the bottom of the video. If you are having any trouble with the closed captions, there will be a link in the chat to the raw caption feed for deaf and hard of hearing folks. Thank you, Mirabai Knight, for doing the live captioning today. Now it's my pleasure to bring in Rima Majid, Lara Bhitar, and Basil Salouh. Rima Majid is a writer, activist, and assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Beirut. Her research focuses on social movements and sectarianism in the Middle East. She has written extensively on the political economy of sectarianism, protests and uprising in Lebanon and Iraq, structural transformation and unemployment in post-war Lebanon, and the importance of labor organizing. Her work has been published in Middle East Eye, Open Democracy, Al Jazeera English, and more. She's currently working on a book that looks at sectarian capitalism in Lebanon. Lara Bhitar is a journalist in Beirut and the founding editor of The Public Source, a Beirut-based independent media organization that covers socioeconomic and environmental crisis afflicting Lebanon since the onset of neoliberal governance in the 1990s, and provides political commentary on events unfolding in Lebanon's current uprising. Her work centers marginalized communities and connects their struggles to broader frameworks. She contributes reports on social movements and civil unrest to grassroots media projects in the US and Lebanon, and writes for regional and feminist publications. Basil Salouh is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Lebanese American University in Beirut. He is co-author of The Politics of Sectarianism in Post-War Lebanon and Beyond the Arab Spring, Authoritarianism and Democratization in the Arab World. And he is co-editor of Persistent Permeability, Regionalism, Localism, and Globalization in the Middle East. His current research interests include a critique of power-sharing arrangements in post-war states and regional dynamics in the Middle East after the popular uprisings. So thank you all for being here. I wanted to start by talking about the explosion that ripped through Beirut just over 2 weeks ago on August 4th. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in world history, and it killed over 200 people and wounded and displaced thousands. So if you all could tell us how the explosion affected the city of Beirut, what was understood popularly to be the cause of the blast, and what was the response on the streets. If you could each speak a bit about this to start us off.
Would you like me to start? I was going to take the question on the street, but Rima, if you'd like to go ahead.
Well, whatever Shireen wants, I'm happy to start. Okay, so I think, first, thank you, Shireen and Danny and Sean and everyone at Haymarket for putting together this event. I think, this explosion is, as you're saying, it's one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions in the history of mankind. Definitely its effects on the city are huge, mainly the effects on the residents of this city, but also of this country more broadly. We're talking about, more than 200 killed. We're talking about around 7,000 injured. We're talking about, still around 20 people missing, but also a capital that, half of the capital has been very heavily affected. More than 200,000 homes and shops have been damaged, glass shattered everywhere, not just in the capital, but everywhere around the country, even in the mountain it was felt. This is an explosion that happened in Beirut and that was felt in Cyprus. This is how big it was. We're also talking about around 8,000 buildings damaged. Some of those are heritage buildings. Now, while the Bhitar has been on the two most gentrified neighborhoods, if you want, of Mar Mikhail and Gemmayzeh, there are many other lower class neighborhoods that were very heavily hit by this blast, such as Karantina, Bush Hamoud, Khanda Al Ghami, etc. And these are areas that are really require an attention, because these are areas that have many residents that are refugees or migrant workers or low-wage workers, and the whole discourse now around reconstruction, although I have many problems with framing it as reconstruction, there's we need to rethink about what city do we want, and reconstruction for whom and by whom. And in many cases, we see that, the aid that has been coming and how it's been distributed, there is some xenophobic and racist discourse around refugees benefiting from the aid or etc. So I think that, there's the risk of falling in a nationalist discourse is something that we need to keep an eye on, and that we need to clearly push against and explaining and understanding what is happening. Also, of course, the class dimension in the sense that, of course, those areas that are most gentrified and where most of the pubs and clubs and, nice restaurants of the city are located were very heavily hit. But also other areas around that region. And, I was just thinking today that there's something almost very sad, but also ironical about the state has just reinforced today kind of a lockdown. And I'm thinking, there's the area called Karantina, which comes from the word quarantine, actually called Karantina because of the quarantine that happened at the beginning of the 20th century during the pandemic back then. This is an area that is now completely shattered. This is a neighborhood. This is actually the closest neighborhood to where the explosion happened. So what does it mean today to call for a lockdown when, even Karantina, no longer has any houses that can be, lived in. So, so there's this context where the damage of the explosion is huge in its human cost, but also in its implication on the city, on a city that was already extremely tired, its residents and the city itself, with almost a year now of financial freefall, mass layoffs that have left many people unemployed, in an economy that already had a very high rate of unemployment, an economy that relies very much on exporting the youth, and that relies on remittances because it's a dollarized economy. While the world is diving into an economic recession, it's very difficult for people to even leave now. So there's a very complex picture in terms of the social implications of a crisis, a pandemic, a revolution that is still struggling against a very harsh counter-revolution that we can talk a bit more about in a bit. But with this explosion, everything was magnified so much. And while one would think that this would be a turning point that would put an end to this ruling class, we quickly realized that actually disaster capitalism is at its best now. We have very quickly seen how international, the countries from around the world have very quickly interfered. All sorts of navies are on the shores of Lebanon now, and we have also seen how real estate companies have quickly jumped on the scenes of those very shattered neighborhoods and trying to already buy those demolished houses or affected houses that they would want to demolish in order to build their high rises. So it's a very critical turning point. The effects on the country are critical because it doesn't just happen. It's not just the explosion, but it's the compounded effect of an explosion, a very, very deep financial crisis. We're talking about a country that has a deficit of around $100 billion. With the explosion, the estimates are that the cost or the loss after the explosion is around $10 to $15 billion. And it has also hit areas where a lot of businesses are centered. So many people have lost their jobs because physically they're no longer there. So it's a very detrimental situation, and I think the effects will keep on unfolding for, I think, years, if not decades to come.
Basil, do you want to talk about the popular conceptions of who was responsible for the blast?
Yeah. I mean, I'll pick up from Reem. A number of issues were underscored by this explosion. First of all, I mean, you get immediately the feeling that there is no state in this country, and the state has no institutional capacity. I mean, for a country that has been through civil war and then a whole long period of reconstruction and post-war and so on, you would think that the state has some kind of ability to manage such a crisis. And immediately it was obvious for everyone that there is really no state response. And so the Lebanese, as is always the case, went into survival mode. I don't know if this is something good or bad. I tend to think the latter, actually, in the sense that people should, after a crisis, should go through a period of healing and not be responsible themselves for doing what the state does. So in addition to the failure of state institutions, there is simply no trust in anything that the state does. And I think this is why this explosion in many ways connects very directly with the pathologies and the paralysis of the political system. People immediately identified it with all that is bad in this political system. And no kind of investigation will be considered trustworthy by most Lebanese. Because they simply do not have any trust either in the intentions or the capabilities of the state. And as Rima was saying, I mean, you would think that such an explosion would shock the political class and the political sectarian elite into, doing something. Most of them, dealt with it as if it's like any other catastrophe that this country has experienced, or they try to free ride it and use it for their own narrow political purposes. But there is something also that I think is very troubling about what has happened in the period immediately after the explosion. Big crises like these can be moments of healing, but there are also moments when you see the real fissures and divisions and how these are being manipulated in Lebanese society. And my greatest fear is that trends that had already been in motion, demands for greater for sectarian communities to move inward, for greater movement, kind of a divorce among what are often considered to be homogeneous sectarian communities is being set in motion by some people. As Rima was saying, the kind of xenophobia, but also the kind of hatred that you heard immediately after the explosion is worrying. And my greatest fear is that for many Lebanese, the location of the explosion, really the cosmopolitan heart of Beirut, and we should not mince words, an area that is also majority Christian, suggests that something about the Lebanon that we've known in the last 100 years may be gone, and this kind of the dynamic that had started before the explosion. My greatest worry is that it will accelerate in the future.
Lara, do you want to talk about the streets?
Yeah, for sure. So in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, just the next day, what we saw was an army of volunteers, 100, if not thousands of people, went down to some of the most damaged neighborhoods. And yes, it should be admitted, like Rima said, that they predominantly focused on some of the gentrified neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that they're most familiar with. These were young students, high school, university students, who came with hard hats, brooms, had no idea what they were doing, but they coordinated their efforts together. And there were small groups of friends who just took to the street and started clearing the debris, started going to the homes of elderly residents, checking up on them, seeing if they needed anything, trying to supply them with medicine, with food. According to the governor of Beirut, and I'm not sure if this figure is accurate, it's about 300,000 people who were rendered homeless because of the explosion. So a lot of different initiatives were very quickly established and created to provide housing for people who no longer had safe housing. And all of this work was being done for the most part by groups that had been established during October 17, during the popular uprising. And I think that's primarily why the response was so quick and why these groups were so rapidly dispatched. I'm part of some of these groups, and immediately within a couple of hours, there was already, plans. Sorry, somebody.
Sorry, keep going.
I'm not sure who that question was addressed to, but it just disappeared. I was saying all of these networks and different groups and initiatives had already been formed, first during October 17, and then to respond to the financial crisis and all of the other things that have been happening in Lebanon for the past year or so. A good comparison in the U.S. would be, Occupy Sandy, and the way Occupy Sandy responded to Hurricane Sandy, I think it was in like the northeast of the U.S. And that was, I think, a result of the organizing and the networks that were established during Occupy Wall Street. And something very, very similar happened here. And I think it's both. It's a blessing in disguise, and we were lucky that all of these groups had already been formed and were ready to be deployed. But very quickly, you had a lot of voices from the left who were worried that by having all of these young people cleaning the street and basically acting on behalf of the state, that they're absolving the state from its responsibilities and its duties. And there was a very big fear that, this anger and this rage that so many of us were feeling was going to be absorbed by this relief work and this aid work. Now, thankfully, that did not happen. What I saw, and I think, what we witnessed across the board was these students that were already starting to receive some form of political education since October 17, that had been engaging in mass student walkouts, that had been going on strike, that had been joining demonstrations, that had, been confronted with a lot of challenges because of the coronavirus, because of the financial situation, because of banks withholding their parents' money and not being able to pay tuition. So it was a continuation of this politicization and, to a certain extent, radicalization of our youth that ultimately culminated in this organizing for a Saturday. It went under many different names, a Saturday of Rage, a Saturday of Vengeance, and there was a demonstration that was organized shortly after the blast. I think it was like 5 days or so. It was expected for the state to unleash all its violence as it had done over the past few months. And it did so. And at the end of the Saturday demonstration, there was hundreds of people who were injured. An incredible amount of tear gas was fired. The security forces were firing directly at people's faces. A few demonstrators lost their eyes. And these demonstrations continued for a few days afterwards. It's good to note that, the state was completely absent, it's true. But at the same time, the security apparatus of the state was almost omnipresent. Different security and intelligence agencies were on the street. They were either decorative, they were just standing around, or they were harassing people who were volunteering. We heard many cases of, questioning people, asking them what they're doing there, asking for identification. Many women were reporting that they were being sexually harassed by these security forces. Later on, they tried, through the Interior Ministry, there was an attempt to regulate this work, and they were asking international and local non-governmental organizations to coordinate the work and to give them notice of what they're doing and who they are and where their funding is coming from. So yes, the state was absent in the relief efforts, but the state was everywhere when it came to intimidate, to harass, and really the moment is really difficult to describe because, the entire city was in mourning. The entire city, it felt like as if it was weeping. And yet you have security and intelligence agencies, coming and people just passing through with their, military vehicles, their big weapons, and filming people who are sweeping the street. So that's kind of an overall image of, at least the first week to 10 days in the immediate aftermath of the explosion.
Can I just jump in to add just 2 points? One is that, I fully agree with what Basil and Lara have described, but I also think that, there's something also to be highlighted in the sense that the port, it's something about uneven development in Lebanon, that the port of Beirut is the port through which more than 70% of our imports come from. For an economy that has almost no productive sectors, so we are, it's an economy that mainly relies on the banking sector and the real estate sector, and that imports everything from fuel to wheat, bread, etc. For bread, and this is why there's always fear of shortage of bread, which we've been hearing again this week. The explosion of the port has also very clear and dangerous impacts on livelihoods and the ability to survive and continue in this country. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, I fully agree that while state institutions are weak and absent in many areas, they're very present when it comes to repressing protest. And the repression we've seen on the first Saturday after the explosion was really unbelievable. And there's something also about that day, because it was a few days after the visit of the French president, who was portrayed as the savior. On that day, thousands of tear gas canisters were thrown at protesters. These are French tear gas canisters. So it also says something about imperial powers and how it functions here. But and the first thing the state has done after the explosion is first they put Beirut under, they announced an emergency law in Beirut, and then the parliament met. And you would think that an exceptional meeting for the parliament would deal with the repercussions of the explosion, but they had one item on the agenda, and it was about announcing a state of emergency in the whole country. So basically, Lebanon is now under the rule of the military, and this says a lot about the month and to come, and how the uprising will continue to unfold. And like Basil, I'm not very optimistic about what is how it's going to unfold. But these are things that we need to know in order to set the ground for further discussion.
Can I add one more idea before we leave the port issue? Because I think there is also. The port is very symbolic of the political economy of corruption in Lebanon. As Rima was saying, 80% of what we consume is imported, and 70% of what we import is through the port of Beirut. Now, what's interesting in the past decades, the one place where you see the different sectarian political parties coexist in a lovely manner is in the port. Because that's where it's like big chunks of it is in no man's land. And that's where they agree on the distribution of the spoils. In fact, for a country that your consumption, 80% of your consumption is from imports, and for a site from which you import 70%, in 1 year, according to one MP, the port of Beirut did not bring to the state any revenues, assuming we didn't import anything. So then the question is raised, where did the money go? Where did the custom revenue go? And so I think if you want to see a good example of the political economy of corruption in the post-war period, it was the port. And now these people who used to make their livelihood from this mechanism are actually worried, because they believe that in any future port, there will be some kind of international monitoring of the port. So it symbolizes a whole many things about the kind of situation we've had in the post-war period.
I don't know if we want to talk more about the explosion itself. We can keep coming back to it, but I did want to spend a good amount of time on, the backdrop, which is for the past almost a year, 10 months now, there's been the uprising, the October Revolution in Lebanon that started last October, it's been the largest uprising in Lebanon's history. It's brought out a large percentage of the country's population into the streets. And, even though the protests have risen and fallen, the momentum, they keep returning to the streets, basically. So my question is, how or what has sustained this movement for so long? And if you each want to speak for 5 to 10 minutes about that again.
I think, the movement, the uprising is still at its early stages, and I think it will continue for a long time. It's a process, and it's a process that has started, one can argue, since December 2010 or 2011 with the Arab uprisings, but it also has a root that, that preceded that in Lebanon. Yes, and we've seen how the movement went through ups and downs with, the revolution very quickly met with a counter-revolution, the efforts at sectarianization, repression, also co-optation from some parties. The difficulties of organizing while the uprising had already started. So it started as a social explosion that needed to be challenged politically, and I think this is where we are. This is the dilemma of today. How do we transform the anger in the street? And it's it has moved from an initial movement that was calling for the downfall or the toppling of the regime, that was calling for accountability, that was against corruption, that was against all of them with the slogan كلن يعني كلن. To what we've seen in the past weeks is a movement that is saying we don't want accountability anymore, we want revenge. And this is what the explosion has really brought out, this anger and this feeling that, we don't believe in any channel anymore. We don't believe in, in the ability to go through a process or a transition. It became very much a matter of survival and revenge. And because it's read as a war that has been waged against us, first economically, but then it also became about security. Literally, we've been blown up in our homes. So I think there's a transition here that that is going to affect how the movement will transform. But also it's an uprising that will go through many stages. It's an uprising that is clear in what it doesn't want, not yet very clear in what it wants, because it wants many things, and within the movement we have many currents, the more liberal, the more radical, the leftist, etc. There have been many efforts since October. A big debate is whether we need to unify the front or to actually divide and to unify amongst those who are closer politically. So can we unify? Can we have an alliance with the radical left with the liberals, or is it better if they organize and mobilize separately? There's a lot of time and effort that is being put on organizing internally. I mean, there's a lot of time put on drafting political papers and discussing these documents, which is important, right? But at the same time, there are political moments and political opportunities that sometimes need to be grasped, and this is when you wish there's a vanguard that would take over and act to overthrow, but we don't have it. We're not there. I think that the specifically for this audience, the left in Lebanon is unfortunately weak. It's not well organized. There's many divisions internally. It's unlikely that this, and if anyone really grasped this moment, it would just be one step in this longer historical, unfolding of this uprising, because those who are more organized are not exactly those who will bring about social justice necessarily. But we've seen many efforts, and we've seen, there's more than 120 groups that were born after this initial spark of the revolution. Many of those groups are very small. I mean, they have sometimes a big presence online, but on the ground, very small groups. And the effort is really about, and I think the challenge is really about, now there's the question of representation, who represents the street, who represents these different groups. But we're very trapped in this paradigm of, a participatory democracy, etc., which is all great. And, there's a big focus on leaderless movements. I dare say, unfortunately, a feature of new social movements that is taking away a lot of the efforts in reflecting internally on how we do what we're doing, rather than analyzing politically the material conditions around us and trying to grasp those opportunities when we can. Of course, it's very important to organize, and again, there's been efforts at organizing unions, effort at organizing, migrant work, at organizing politically around different ideas, at organizing, and it's interesting. It shifted from a big social explosion, and that is focused in the squares of the different regions of the country, but then it became targeted mobilizations against specific institutions, whether it's private companies or state institutions, and then we've seen how it was the students who have, it became about schools and universities. So, we've seen how this has been transforming in terms of tactics and in terms of targets. One very interesting thing about the uprising also is how, in the absence of a labor movement that has been systematically, co-opted since the mid-90s in Lebanon, people were somehow aware and knew that at the core of this, it's a matter of stopping labor or the engine of production somehow, or accumulation, and because we were unable to enforce a strike, it was road blockades, and to me these are equal to strikes, because people were actually blocking roads and burning tires to shut down the country, and by shutting down the country, it meant no one goes to work, no one does. So it is a kind of, it's a different way of doing strikes. So these tactics are all very important to understand, how things might unfold. And we've seen that, everyone knew, and we were expecting that with the deepening of the financial crisis, there would be more layoffs and more unemployment or unemployment. And we've already started to see this with some universities. Like the biggest employer in this country is, after the state, is a university that has laid off 850 workers in one day. But we have also seen the weaknesses of organizing there, the inability to strike, and the politics of, what Berlin calls a cruel optimism. People thinking that, if I don't mobilize, maybe I can keep my job, or I can go back to my job, or people just feeling thankful that they still have a job, even if their salary is now worth. We've lost more than 80% of our purchasing power, but there are all these considerations that make it difficult for organization. And on top of that, I think this is at the labor level, but at also the political level, we know that safety or security is the main issue, and people are really scared. This is a country where we're ruled by, this is a mafia rule, and militias are still around, and people know that, and we've seen in many cases people have been targeted by the thugs of those militias. So it also becomes about, there's serious fear about safety, and Lebanon and Iraq are very close to each other in their makeup, and also in the geopolitical scene. So what we're seeing in Iraq, and just yesterday, is something that I would not be surprised at all if we start seeing more of that in Lebanon: targeted assassinations, killing or attacks against activists, etc. And I think people are aware and know that, and this is why organizing or being prepared for this struggle. This is not a struggle that is going to be peaceful, unfortunately, not because we are, we're happy with blood, not because we are not peaceful and we're violent, but because it's a very violent system that is not going to to let us get away without it being very violent against us.
Basil, do you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
what's sustained the movement from an economic lens?
Yeah, well, I mean, from an economic perspective, given how bad the situation is, you would expect greater numbers of people in the street all the time. I mean, as Rima was saying, 80% of our purchasing power has evaporated. And so whether 17 October onwards, 17 October was the explosion of real economic, socioeconomic anger and deprivations. And of course, immediately the sectarian parties, some of them, gave it a week to diffuse, some tried to free ride it and so on. But the question that I keep asking myself, and I think this is important for your audience, is how come decades of socioeconomic crisis peaking now with the overlapping economic, financial, banking, environmental, and now with this disaster. I mean, as a Latin American scholar once put it, where are all the protesters? I mean, you would expect much more people. And I think that's where Gramsci comes in, particularly for your audience. Because remember, Gramsci teaches us that you always need to link structure with ideology. I think this is really the genius of the Lebanese sectarian system, whereby it's very successful in creating this sectarian ideological hegemony, which is built, again, following Gramsci, on a particular political economy, what myself and others, Hannes Bowman, call the political economy of sectarianism. But what is interesting is that this political economy is in crisis, and yet you see the sectarian parties able to continue. And if they want to field people to the street, they would overwhelm anyone. And so that's why I think Gramsci is so important, that we should not speak of demonstrations as if it is something natural. I mean, that comes as a result of socioeconomic problems and political problems. But the question that I keep asking myself, well, what's happening on the other side? And again, as Rima was saying, I mean, the technology of the sectarian system in Lebanon was so effective since 1990 onwards that it was very good in destroying any kind of avenues for alternative opposition movement, whether from the labor movement, whether the professional syndicates, whatever we call the left, and so on. And so you are in this conundrum now whereby sectarian parties, despite the economic crisis, are still very strong. Coercively, they are strong ideologically. And again, I mean, I'm bringing Gramsci because I think he's very important here. The other side, in their multiplicity and in their diversity, they are being asked to organize in a situation of crisis, and they are being asked to do in 1 year what it took the sectarian system, well, almost 100 years to achieve. And so I think this is why we have to link political economy with ideology. We have to remember that the sectarian system remains very powerful, and it can use an array of techniques, ideological, coercive, what have you. And that is the problem that we find ourselves in now, that despite this massive economic crisis, the guys on the other side feel that they are stronger and that they can continue to sustain themselves.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Basil. Thank you. Lara, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about this question, how the movement has sort of taken on new dimensions, as Rima said, from 2011 to now, basically.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll start where Basil ended. That the bad guys think that they're stronger after the explosion. But something that's been really interested to me is that a lot of the grassroots organizing and the various leftist groups and feminist groups and student groups managed to kind of shake off some of the shock that we all experienced after the explosion and do a lot of organizing underground to agitate ahead of the Saturday demonstration, to distribute propaganda. There were several car convoys that were going around. While granted, a commonly echoed sentiment was now is time for the gallows. But at the same time, there was also, the sense that we don't only want to execute people and those who are responsible for the blast, that, ultimately street justice is not, that there was a strong demand from particular leftist groups for, one, accountability, and two, justice for the victims. So 3 days after the blast, a group of some of these different leftist groups as well put out a statement, and I just want to briefly read some excerpts that I translated, and not word for word, but just to give your audience that I think might be interested in some of this resistance that's now happening on the ground, and some of the sentiment, some of this organizing that's happening as well. So it reads, quote, "On August 4, 2020, the authorities admitted to their criminality when they declared a state of emergency. Declaring a state of emergency is akin to declaring war on those who survived, and a declaration of a growing police state. On August 4, 2020, the authorities declared war on us, and we declare the start of a battle for liberation. October 17 is no more. We won't make demands anymore. We will struggle to liberate our city from its occupiers. We will struggle to liberate the money of small depositors from the banks, to liberate people from the corruption of these occupiers, and ultimately to liberate ourselves from the system." And this is a reference to something that the Lebanese president had said early on in the demonstrations, addressing protesters. He simply said, "If you don't like it, you can immigrate." So the statement reads, "On August 4, 2020, the battle for your departure, not ours, has started." And then there was like an alternative media platform called Propaganda, who was also agitating for these protests. And they had this illustration that read, "We will drag you over the scattered glass of Beirut." So granted, there is this feeling that, now is the time for vengeance, but also a lot of the unseen is this underground organizing that's happening between a lot of different groups who share a political vision. Rima raised the point of whether or not the radical left or the left more broadly, should be in bed with liberals. I think, learning from what has happened over the past 10 years, I think that would be a mistake to kind of compromise and be in an alliance or network of sorts with liberals. But to answer directly the question, I think, what has sustained this uprising is a never-ending onslaught of calamities, and obviously the latest of which was the explosion at the fort. But for a little bit of context of what was happening before October 17, because October 17 is often described as this explosion, as this eruption of fury and anger. But this was in the making for at least a couple of years. When the parliamentary elections were last held in May of 2018, and these parliamentary elections, after having been postponed for many, many years for bullshit reasons, frankly, and the results of these elections came out, as they were expected. Despite a reformed electoral law that was in theory supposed to give independent candidates a shot, but the same old faces re-emerged. And after the elections, over the coming months, the economic situation started deteriorating. And that's when protests started towards the end of 2018. And they were in small pockets all around the country. Every other day, there was a different sector that was demonstrating, whether it was like retired servicemen fighting for their pensions, public sector employees demanding a wage raise. Mm-hmm. And then, that we had, starting into early 2019, these one-day strikes by also various sectors. So October was the culmination of over almost 2 years of mobilizations on a small scale. And of course, there's a very rich and important history of organizing that precedes 2010. But if we want to look just at the last decade, at the start of the Arab uprisings, in Lebanon, there's two moments that we can pause at, and that the October 17 moment builds on. The first one, of course, being 2011, which were demonstrations against the sectarian political system in Lebanon. And the second one in 2015, what was initially dubbed the anti-garbage protests eventually grew to become anti-government protests that tackled all aspects of whether it's government corruption, abuse of power, so on and so forth. So I think, it's important to understand that October 17 is just a continuation of these two mobilizations and organizing that had been happening for decades, despite the suppression of labor movements, suppression of protest in general in Lebanon. In October 2019, what was really fascinating to me was how much the political discourse had grown and had matured. And in particular, in the first 10 days or in the first 2 weeks of October 17, I was really taken by how radicalized, at least seemingly, Lebanese society had become on these roadblocks that usually, drivers would complain about. We would be, on a roadblock, and drivers would thank us and say, "Ya'tikun al-afiyah," and thank you so much, even though it was disrupting the flow of traffic, it was disrupting their work. But there was a general sense that now is the time to do something, despite the inconveniences on an individual level. So it seemed, at least in the first few weeks, that there was acceptance for direct action. There was a sustained general strike for about 10 days or so shortly after October 17. I think it started on October 21st. There was this really newfound radicalization that I witnessed at the beginning of October 17 that was interesting and that builds on what we had seen in the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to take a little bit of a step back. Maybe we can step back to explain to an audience that isn't familiar very much with the Lebanese political system. I think it was very helpful, Basil, when you talked about Gramsci and the sectarian system, but could you all explain a little bit more about how the sectarian system works? Just because I know a lot of the audience is not that familiar with Lebanon. I know, Rima, you've used the term sectarian capitalism, so maybe explaining a little bit about why you use that term, and then talking about give a broader picture of how that works. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I've been thinking and trying to write recently about the concept of sectarian capitalism, and obviously I'm in conversation with the literature and the theories on racial capitalism, not just to borrow and reproduce the same theory here, but it's really about how do we get beyond the exceptionalism of the Middle East when we talk about sectarianism, but also the exceptionalism of the US when we talk about race? And how do we think about identitarian politics or the politics of identity and its links with capitalism? So, and at the core of this, it's really about thinking of both sectarianism, racism, but also patriarchy, communalism in other parts of the world, and all these types of identity divisions as an engine of capitalism. And in my case, about thinking about the centrality of sectarianism for the rise of capitalism, in the late 19th century, Mount Lebanon, but then there are some excellent historical accounts that have already showed us how there's this link between the rise in political sectarianism, or the sectarianization of or the politicization of sectarian difference, and the rise of capitalism and in this part of the world. But it's what I'm trying to also look at is not just how it emerged, but also how it developed and metamorphosed with time, and therefore, what do we make of sectarian neoliberalism more specifically, and how is neoliberalism interacting with, or is really, how is sectarianism at the heart of neoliberalism? And this is not to say that neoliberalism or capitalism would not exist if we don't have sectarianism, right? There would be other sorts of divisions that will be exploited, but it's really to think about how those identity divisions are used beyond the idea of just homogeneous groups that are oppressing and exploiting each other. Because in this case, and I think the case of sectarianism can also be very enlightening to think about racism, because this is a case where the hierarchy is not as clear, right? The divisions are not as clear, and therefore thinking about race and its it's kind of its fluidity and race beyond the categories themselves, and how it interacts with class and with accumulation of capital is very useful in this case, because we see that it's not just about inter-sectarian exploitation or division. It's not about the class sect. It's not about all the Shias are poor and exploited, but it's very much about also intra-sectarian exploitation or cross-sectarian alliances of class. So it's about this complex picture where beyond saying that all debates were about whether it is sectarian or it's not sectarian, right? So it's either a class struggle or a sectarian conflict. And now we're starting, I mean, myself and many others, I think, to think about, well, it's both. And how do they feed into each other? And what are these processes that unfold with neoliberalism? And how is sectarianism or sectarianization shifting to benefit neoliberalism and the accumulation of capital? So I'm focused on that aspect because there's been a lot written about the institutionalization of sectarianism in the region, and of course this is an important history that the history of colonialism and the institutionalization of identity politics, power sharing, and this idea of the deeply divided society paradigm. As if there are societies around the world that are shallowly divided, right? As if class division is not deep or gender divisions are not deep enough. And then there is a history on, the political economy of Lebanon, the centrality of the banking sector and the financial sector. But there isn't a lot of work that merges these two literatures together. So I'm trying in this book project to do that, and to also think about change and shift in the salience of sectarian boundaries and sectarian, but also the content of those groups beyond the groupism of, using sects as the basis for sectarianism. So this is on one hand. On the other hand, I mean, an important aspect to understand sectarianism and why, we talk about sectarianism from above. The elites use sectarianism for obvious reasons, but then why do people follow, right? And here comes, as Basil was saying, the importance of ideology, but then also, the way clientelism works, and there's a lot written and I think very important work on clientelism, some of which is Basil's work. So clientelism in the sense of non-state welfare, if you wish. So there's a clear the state state institutions have been weakened. There's no welfare state in Lebanon, and the only way people can access services or benefits or help is by going through those sectarian leaders, and in many cases not even the sectarian leaders. And this is a system that is very, very strong at the neighborhood level. So it's those in charge of neighborhoods for each political party that really if you want divide the spoils, not to everyone, of course, and it's not a non-state welfare that is equal and that is just. It's one that reproduces or sectarianizes in order to be used in not just electoral politics but also everyday politics. And this is where I think there's another aspect of clientelism that we should also look at, and that is security and safety. Because in many cases, what those parties are using, they promise sometimes financial or material help, but in many cases it's also about giving you backing or protecting you, or so it could be positive rewards. It could also be a negative sanction by by threatening you, by actually, not giving you electricity, for example. And we've heard a lot of stories about people who've participated in the uprising and who were, clearly attacked at the neighborhood level where they reside because of their participation, where they were excluded from some services, or they were on purpose, targeted because of that. And this is why it's a very complex system. These parties also have their institutions, right? They have their hospitals, their schools, their universities, etc. So I think that, yes, sectarianism is a whole system, and it created its structures, but also its culture. And this is why it reproduces itself, and it's a system that is, strong. But I also don't think that it's a system that is impossible to topple. It's also a system that relies very much on geopolitics and relationships with, countries abroad or regional international forces. And we've seen in this past year that there has been many holes in the system that one could have used, and we have seen that the system is sometimes cornered. So we've seen its fragility sometimes. But it's very quick at reproducing itself, and since 2011 it became very clear, even before. But for example, the municipal elections in 2000, after the 2015 uprising movement, we've seen how in Beirut all political parties, those who've been against each other for decades, who have fought against each other, they all ran on the same list together against what was then called civil society. So they are, their class awareness is very high, and maybe the one way for us to fight them is for us to also work on our class awareness, and that is not just about an us versus them that is loose, but really about labor relations, class relations, and what it means in this broader struggle that has been unleashed in Lebanon since October 2019.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add something, Shireen?
Oh, please, yeah.
I think for your audience, it's quite interesting to know why what's happening in Lebanon is different from, say, the politics of multiculturalism or interculturalism in North America and Europe. I mean, if you look at Lebanon from Europe or North America, you say, okay, what's the problem with sectarian identities? I mean, let everybody celebrate their own identities, and let power sharing works in some places, so why doesn't it work in Lebanon? I think, just sort of for background for your audience, I mean, the problem in Lebanon is that the sectarian system, after going through a period where it was necessary to establish some kind of agreement on what is really a state that was created by colonial fiat, now, with all the intersectional elements it has, the violence against women, the violence against minorities, the violence against regions, the violence against the poor, and so on. Sectarian identities now are being imposed and recreated and reproduced, if you like, through the kind of complicated machinery that Rima was talking about. So it's very important for your audience to know that there are multiple struggles going on in Lebanon at the same time now. And I think that is part of the problems that Lara was talking about and Rima. One struggle is inside the sectarian political parties, meaning those who want to impose, and this is the analogy with Iraq. In fact, in many ways, Iraq is a later day Lebanon. I mean, what's happening in Iraq today, we went through it in the late 1980s in Lebanon. So on one side, you have those who want to impose one identity and one identity only, and that is the sectarian identity. And they will use violence to impose that identity. There's a struggle inside that sectarian system around the balance of power inside that system. The other struggle in the country, and this is the one that we saw emerging beautifully on the 17th of October is between all those who still believe that for ideological reasons, material reasons, what have you, the sectarian system represents them, and between all those who just do not accept that this system has any more validity, and they are searching for something new. And again, I don't want to repeat what was said earlier. The problem is that you are trying now to create a new system which should look the exact opposite of the one that has been established. Again, to come back to Gramsci, the old is dead, the new has yet to be born. This is the age of zombies. And all the abnormalities that we are living through in Lebanon is in great measure a consequence of this struggle.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I was thinking maybe to put more context into the gallows and the demand for vengeance. It's because, even though the uprising has taken down Hariri, et cetera, you see this rotating ruling class that people find they're responsible because for the explosion. They didn't bother to mention over 7 years that there's 2,700 tons of nitrate in this building. But it's also, the connection to the sectarian system is clear when people are saying, we're the popular revolution, you're the civil war, you're the sectarian civil war. And so those are the new lines that are drawn more on class and the separation from that, the desire to separate from the previous sectarian system, I guess. There's so much more to cover. I guess if you guys could speak more about the regional and international dimensions of this crisis. For example, what should internationalists and socialists globally know, and how should they agitate to support the protesters in Lebanon who are in worse economic conditions and continue to go out in the streets? Basil, I don't know if you want to start this one off.
Well, I'll start. I'll give it a shot. I think what they should know is that this is not a simple colonial, anti-colonial, imperial, anti-imperial struggle. Mm-hmm. What they should know is, again, as Gramsci, as Edward Said used to remind us all the time, you're either with truth and justice, freedom, democracy, everywhere, or you're not. You cannot pick and choose. And I think that's very important to understand the choices that some of the political actors make in Lebanon. The other thing I think which is very important, in terms of the Lebanese diaspora community and the Lebanese internationalists, if you like, there's a lot of support. But the other thing, I think the lesson that can be taken from Lebanon, as Rima was saying, is going back to politics. I hate to use this word, but in the classical sense of politics, that is organization, long-term organization, a kind of a Hannah Arendt agonic understanding of politics. That is, there are no half-truths. To borrow from Max Weber, struggle is not a taxi you can stop at any corner. You have to stay with it all the time. Lebanon now also, from a kind of an international perspective, we are really in a very different situation. People who are trying to make change in this country. And this is because of the international and geopolitical spotlight on the country. What is the role of the international community is the elephant in the room today, in the sense that a lot of people who want change in Lebanon feel that it cannot be done without the help from the external actors. The problem is that external actors seem to be divided between those who want to reproduce the system, which is reproduce the sectarian system, and those who want to tweak it in their own favor. And so the choices for people, for those struggling in Lebanon to change the system are not easy. They are very messy. They become very complicated. And they are not binaries. I am anti-colonial or whatever. It's a very complicated situation. And I think for your audience, again, one's position on Israel is not enough. One's position on imperialism is not enough. What's much more important is to focus on well, what's your position on the right of minority groups, the right of women, the right for freedom, democracy in Lebanon, in Iraq, and so on. So it's a very complicated situation.
Maybe I'll add a few points here. I think, there's been a lot of support from the Lebanese diaspora, but also from people around the world in terms of donations, in terms of, aid, like humanitarian involvement. And that is great. But I think what we need now, maybe more than charity, although we need, the support is solidarity, and solidarity in the political sense. And why am I saying that? Because I think that what happened in Lebanon, this explosion and the aftermath of it, and the fact that, all countries from the US to France to Russia to Turkey to Iran are all and of course Israel are all now meddling with how the politics of the aftermath of the explosion is very much about how are they going to divide the pie, right? Wanting a hegemony over the region is very much about the resources. It's very much about who will control the port, who will control the electricity. So in that sense, as I said at the beginning, it's disaster capitalism, and this is nothing peculiar to Lebanon. It happened in Lebanon. It could have happened anywhere else, and we've seen it in other places. So the struggles here are not detached from the struggles elsewhere. These are really global struggles against capitalism, but also against what we as we've seen in Syria, authoritarianism as well. And the system in Lebanon that is called consociational democracy has nothing to do with democracy. It is an authoritarian system. But this is really to say for an internationalist response to this is about politicizing the response to what happened in Lebanon and reading it from this lens of a global crisis. And the fact that it happened in Lebanon is one can understand the reasons why Lebanon, but it doesn't prevent it happening anywhere else. And we have already seen it. And I think we'll continue to see how disaster capitalism will unfold in many parts of the world. And saying that we need to politicize our solidarity, this is also about pressuring where you are, right? Pressuring your own governments, organizing where you are, and linking those struggles together. For us also, all these states and state leaders work together. They meet and they concoct. They're sitting now in secret meetings, cooking what they will feed us next in this region. Maybe we should do the same. We should connect more with each other. We should build more our solidarity networks. We should work more to understand together how global capitalism is unfolding in different places and what it means for all of us. And sometimes pressuring in one place in the world can have a lot of effect in another place of the world. So with the elections coming up in the US, it's very much about who's going to also become president in the US, right? It's very much also about where your tax money is going. And I think in that sense, it's our duty everywhere to struggle because it's a system that is linked globally, and it's difficult to imagine socialism in one country detached from the rest of the world. So it's a global struggle, and it's by broadening our networks, working more together, strengthening our organization, that we really support protesters in Lebanon and protesters around the world, from Belarus to Chile.
I wanted to turn to you, Lara. I know you've been involved in a lot of really exciting work on the ground in the uprising. Specifically with media justice work. So if you could talk about the role of left-wing media in the uprising. I know you've been involved in several Megaphone and the publication you co-founded, The Public Source. Megaphone's another online publication from Lebanon, and Akhbar Saha is another one. Could you speak about that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to very briefly touch on the question that you asked earlier about how folks abroad can, be in solidarity with the ongoing struggle in Lebanon. I have this great fear, and I see these so-called anti-imperialists already, roaming around, our corpses, and seeing this as an opportunity to either further their agendas or to get a book deal and so on. So just, my one word on that is don't repeat, what's ongoing right now in Syria and Lebanon. And I think there's a very high likelihood that it's going to happen because I already see it happening. Had the call of local organizers, build networks with people who are on the ground and share your politics, be in constant communication, let others who are here and who understand the situation and who are struggling and who are doing so at a great expense to their lives, to their eyes, to their bodies, to their livelihoods, let them lead and just basically follow their lead. So media. Generally, journalism is in crisis, not just in Lebanon, but around the world. And that precedes October 17, and that has been ongoing for many, many years. Ownership of media organizations in Lebanon are, concentrated in a handful of wealthy families. I think there's about, not handful, 12 families who control the media landscape in Lebanon. So it's very hard to be able to reach wider audiences if you're an independent media platform or an activist platform. But over the past few years, there's been several media initiatives that have been very successful and that have managed to share information, verify what's happening on the ground. Akhbar al-Seha, for example, that wasn't founded in 2019, but it was founded in 2015 during the anti-garbage protest and has been ongoing and has grown exponentially over the past few months. I think they have about 100,000 followers on Facebook, and they're now viewed as a trustworthy, as if news organization. And as far as I know, it's run by a bunch of volunteers. So Akhbar al-Seha is one notable example of, media activists who are on the ground and who are reporting on what's happening firsthand and not relying on TV channels or the mainstream press for information. And oftentimes they're much faster at relaying what's happening and much faster at verifying or debunking allegedly what's happening than mainstream platforms. Megaphone is also another media initiative, and I think it's been in existence for the past 3 years, I think, or maybe 4 years. And what they've been doing is actually quite remarkable. There are also a bunch of volunteers. I think there's about 30 of them or so, and they respond to the news. So they provide very quick updates with commentary, sometimes quite forceful commentary, very political. That informs of what's happening, but also serves as a tool to mobilize and to organize people who might, be at home and be reluctant to join. So I'll briefly talk about the public source, which was launched at the beginning of this year. So we've been out for about 6 months or so. The initial idea behind the public source was to focus solely on in-depth and long-form journalism. We really wanted to address some of the social, economic, environmental crises that Lebanon has been facing for the past 3 decades. So when the idea for the publication was initially conceived a few months before the October Uprising, we knew that there was going to be planned austerity measures, the looming financial crisis. All of these things were expected to cause a lot of disturbances, a lot of chaos. We kind of anticipated that there was going to be some form of resistance. Of course, we never anticipated that it was going to be in the form of a popular uprising. But we wanted to be able to create a media organization, one that is independent and that is focused on investigative journalism. Of course, while there are several investigative units, most prominently the one affiliated to Al-Jadid that has been doing really good work, we wanted, to establish an organization that is truly independent from the political agendas of the different parties that control the media in Lebanon. We wanted to at least attempt to name the individuals who are responsible for, the catastrophic state of affairs right now, and more importantly, try to pinpoint who's benefiting from all of these crises ongoing for many years. So on our platform, we are attempting to support a culture of whistleblowing. We have the only whistleblowing platform that's tied to a media organization in Lebanon, one of a handful around the Arab world. It's called Serreb, which means leak. We have a couple of different tools on there where potential whistleblowers could contact us safely, securely, and anonymously. We launched the platform with the dispatches from the October Revolution. So we're providing commentary, analysis, reflections from the street, from people who have a stake in the struggle. So we don't have a huge output, and we're not putting stuff out on a daily basis. But there's a lot of reflection and thought behind the pieces that we commission. We're very selective about who we work with. We're interested in primarily, commissioning articles by people who have been in different struggles for a long time. And we're very conscientious of whose voices we elevate and maybe by extension, whose voices we don't. And I'm sorry if I took too much time, but the last thing I want to say about the public source, because we're trying to build this media organization not just to be an independent platform for a certain kind of journalism, but our organizational structure is very important to us. So we run a non-hierarchical structure, equal decision-making among all of the members of the collective. We're very transparent about where we get our funding from, how our funding is allocated to different members of the collective. We're gonna launch in a couple of days an internship program, which, as far as I know, is the only paid media internship program in the country. We're very conscientious that labor should be compensated, and we compensate our members of the collective, obviously, but also everyone we work with, and in particular our interns who will be doing meaningful work, who we hope we're able to train them to become investigative journalists and stick around in this profession.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I'm sorry. You mentioned to me how the public source and the other media outlets are really helping to agitate people into the streets in this moment in new ways that haven't been.
In new ways. I mean, I see Megaphone and the public source to a certain extent complementary. The Megaphone is doing very quick dispatches of what's happening, reporting from the ground. They have a ton of stuff that's coming out on a daily basis. We have long form, in-depth kind of analysis and trying to kind of position where we are and try to understand this very crucial moment that we now find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left. I feel like there's so much more to get in depth on. I know one thing that's there's a lot of confusion about in the West, I think, is the role of Hezbollah. I know it's either seen as like a uniquely right-wing terrorist organization, or on the other hand, it's seen, as you guys were alluding to, an anti-imperialist, anti-state by some people, usually in the Western left. So maybe if we could talk a little bit about what is Hezbollah's role in Lebanon itself and how protesters navigate their role in the movement. I don't know if Rima wants to tackle that or anybody else.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. As you rightly point out, Hezbollah is not an anti-imperialist, party, and it's, Hezbollah is a party that was born out of the Iranian Islamic Revolution, so it's very much linked to the Iranian state, is today the strongest party in the country because it has the militarily it's the strongest, but also politically it's one it entered the political life through institutions after 2005, and its alliance with the party of the President of the Republic, the FBM, made this camp politically the strongest in the country. They also control most of the main institutions and also the borders. So Lebanon has just two borders, one with occupied Palestine, Israel, and the other is with the Syrian state. Hezbollah also occupies the airport, allegedly the port that exploded, or at least it divides its control over the port with other parties. But it's a party that has a lot of influence internally. It's a party, unlike what unlike what they like to say, that they've never used their arm internally. They have used their arms internally repeatedly. Actually, since their very start during the civil war, they used their arms internally, but they've continued to do that in 2008. They did that in May 2008. And just yesterday, we've seen clashes, intra-Shia clashes, if you want, in some villages. So in that sense, Hezbollah is a party that is playing, that is taking a side in those bigger imperial struggles in the region. It is clearly a political arm of Iran and Lebanon. And in that sense, yes, it has played an important role as a resistance movement in liberating the south of Lebanon. But it's also important to know that the resistance in the south had started way before Hezbollah was even created. And what Hezbollah has actually done is it monopolized resistance against Israel and sectarianized it. So in that sense, it's definitely not a progressive force. It's one that has also been, very oppressive internally with any opponents, and they are they're no longer guerrilla. It's no longer guerrilla warfare and resistance movement. It's a party that is in represented in all state institutions. It's part of the mafia rule. It controls areas. It controls borders. It smuggles goods. It has its own economy. It has its own army. So it's really a very strong party, and it's also one that is playing the game with everyone else. They sit on the negotiation table. They sat with the French president. They are bargaining, and they're using the stick of the resistance to negotiate on that table. It's also in the past 7 years, what this party has become, we've seen some other horrible sides of this party, with it branching out to fight in Syria, but also in other countries in the region, and this is very unfortunate. So it's really a counter-revolutionary force. Hezbollah went to Syria to actually crush the revolution, and they can call it all they want, as a resistance against the Islamist Sunni. They have tried to sectarianize it, but the fact remains that they have sided with the criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, and in that sense, it's impossible to think of them as an anti-imperialist force or a progressive force. They are actually a party that is supporting and upholding authoritarian regimes and capitalism. They have, Hezbollah is a major, they have no problem. They said it very clearly. They were inviting the IMF. So anyone on the anti-imperialist left who has the illusion that this is a socialist party, Hezbollah is your typical neoliberal capitalist force. So from where I stand, this is what Hezbollah is. And it's actually one of the most dangerous, it's not the only dangerous party in the country, but it's one of the most dangerous parties. And the fact that in the past week they've used this before repeatedly, but we've heard this very clearly this past week in the speech of Nasrallah, talking about the civil war and threatening with a civil war. Is not this is not just by coincidence that they're bringing this up now. In Syria, it started the same way, right? And civil war. I mean, there's no society in the world that slips into civil war. A war is a decision, and it's a decision that is taken by those who can go to war. And then the others will get armed if they do. So, it worries me when we start to hear about this, because it probably means that this is on the table now more seriously. And what I'm trying to say is that if we go to war, Hezbollah will be responsible of not alone, but it will be one of the responsible forces that will take us to war.
We just about have to wrap up, but if Basil or Lara want to add in either on this question or any other thoughts, last thoughts.
I guess, for your own audience, I think it's important that we think about the struggle against sectarianism as something similar to the struggle against neoliberalism. The need to create a new kind of identity beyond narrow sectarian affiliations, and also the need to think about how we go to a new form of social democracy and social justice. And what Lara was talking about is so important. Again, it goes back to this whole issue of the ideological hegemony of sectarians. So the work she's doing is to offer a new kind of truth, because a lot of the media in Lebanon is part of this, the machine about manufacturing consent. So the struggle against sectarianism and the struggle against neoliberalism are the same. In fact, the sectarian parties, as Rima was saying, converge on neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm just going to very briefly address the Hezbollah question. I doubt that to anyone's mind Hezbollah is, a progressive force for good or anti-imperialist, and for all of the reasons that Rima already outlined. My concern is this focus on Hezbollah that could potentially lead us to war. October 17th started with a very basic premise of all of them means all of them. But now what we've been seeing, especially after the explosion at the port, is all of these manufactured reports claiming evidence that Hezbollah was behind the explosion, that Hezbollah was storing this ammonium nitrate there, that they were going to use it to manufacture weapons. So far, all of these have been baseless, and there's been no evidence that's been presented. So yes, locally, internally, in our conversations and in leftist circles, we can admit that Hezbollah has played a really detrimental role in many different aspects. But we have to be very, very careful, especially when speaking to an international audience and when doing work outside of Lebanon and outside of our narrow circles, not to pinpoint all of the blame on solely Hezbollah and the party's allies, but to just focus on the very basic premise that all of these political parties have been in cahoots with each other for 40 years. And if they're not directly involved in a particular crime, that at least they've been complicit through their silence. And I think that's just important for us to remember, because ultimately a war on Hezbollah is not going to necessarily be a war on Hezbollah. It's going to be a war on the Lebanese people, whether it's economic warfare or direct military strikes. Ultimately, the people of this country will pay the price of this war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was very important, I think. Thank you. People on the chat, before we wrap up, people on the chat were asking for more information. I'll just say follow the public source, follow Megaphone, Akhbar Saha. We've posted, I think, on the Facebook event page, articles by the three speakers. We can try to post some more resources as well. But yeah, we have to wrap up now. But thank you so much for being in this conversation today.
Thank you so much.